Okay, I am an instructor for GCC. Two of my specialities are history of trails and history of Grand Canyon women, or as a professor friend of mine likes to call it, herstory. So Ada Bass was one of our pioneer ladies. Ada Bass, a rough and tumble life. William Wallace Bass, of course, was working back east in Chicago and New York. His doctor advised him to come out west for a healthier lifestyle. In 1884, he wound up on the South Rim. He made friends with a lot of the Havasupai, and he would carry the mail in and out for them sometimes. He brought them medicine when they had a measles epidemic. Sometimes he would lend them money. And in return, they showed him some of their routes down into the canyon. He developed 50 miles of roads and trails, more than any other individual. And he had exclusive use of the Topacoba Trail to take tourists in and out of Supai as time went on. William Wallace liked to say that there are three liars at the Grand Canyon. John Hance is one, and I am the other two. He did have mine claims. Of course, that was one way to guarantee that the feds wouldn't kick you out right away. He had a copper mine. He had an asbestos mine. And the asbestos was actually pretty valuable. There were 4-inch fibers. The standard today is like 1/4-inch fibers. He did ship asbestos as far as China and Europe. And there are theater curtains in London and France made with Bass asbestos. But no matter how good your ore is, as most prospectors figured out, it's much more lucrative and easier to take tourists in and out. And so he started a tourist facility. This is one of his later handouts. Poet and geologist of the Grand Canyon may be found in front of her camp's independent store. 30 years experience. If you're from Missouri, we can show you. Not popular with Harvey or the railroad. So Ada Diefendorf was a piano teacher in New York State. At the age of 25, she would have been considered an old maid. But she had an aunt in Prescott, and she came out to Prescott. The aunt managed a hotel. In 1895, she saw one of Bass's little ads to visit the South Rim, and she thought, well, what the heck, why not? 5 months later, they were married. He must have been a real charmer. So for their honeymoon, they took off from Williams in a horse-drawn wagon. Cataract Creek flooded. They were trapped at an old sinkhole that Bass called the cave, so he had a camp set up there. And they were stuck there for a month because the roads were so impassable. And if she thought life was going to get better once she got to the rim, she was sadly disabused. Apparently, William Wallace had a problem with liquor. Whenever he got any money, he would go to a town and go rip-roaring drunk until it was all gone. If he went on one of his many expeditions, and he did a lot of tours around the country to promote tourism at the Grand Canyon, he would come back with a suitcase full of letters from women that Ada said apparently he forgot to destroy. At one point, William Wallace got really ill. She had to take him into Williams, and since they didn't have a house there, she had to pay for the boarding house. She sold her bedspread, her quilt, her silver, and her music just to get the money to survive until he got better. In 1896, she went home for the birth of her first child, and she stayed there for 3 years. That's postpartum depression. William Wallace did talk her into coming back, and eventually there were 4 little Basses. Edith Jane, William Jr., Hazel Kenyanita, and Maybella Melba. Originally they were homeschooled because, of course, Bass Camp is way out there. By 1911, the family had moved into the village, and there were enough children to start a school, Grand Canyon School. William Wallace donated the lumber to build a school, and the Bass children made up half of the enrollment. So William Wallace got there by stagecoach. And first the coach went from Williams. This took 2 days because they had to cross Cataract Creek and then spend the night at the caves and then continue on. In 1885, he went to the railroad and tried to convince an executive that they really needed a spur to the South Rim. And the executive said, no one will go that far to look at a hole in the ground. In 1894, he kind of settled in on Ashfork as his theater of operations, and he built a road from Ashfork. In 1901, the train came in. The train would stop about 4 miles from the village, and that was Bass Siding. And then if you wanted to visit Bass Camp, you hopped off there, rode out to Bass Camp, rode back, waved down the train, and continued on your journey. One of Ada's many jobs was to break the horses. And Bill Jr. said that they would get the horse, they would blindfold the horse, put hobbles in the horse, fasten the horse to the wagon, and then Ada would rip off the blindfold and jump in the back. And the horse would run like crazy. When it tired out, Ada would go out and remove the hobbles. So they did build a kind of a road from Ashfork. Ada said, I camped out or cooked a meal under every tree between Ashfork and the rim. Originally, the facility in the South Rim is called Camper's Paradise, and of course, that would become Bass Camp. It was a big circus tent, canvas tent for the guests. When the guests overflowed the tent, they would move into the house, which wasn't very popular with the family because then they had to sleep on the floor. No water out there, of course, so Bass had a series of cisterns, and he built some catch dams for water. So they had to haul all of their water. He knew there was a spring on the Esplanade, Mystic Spring, but he couldn't find it. And finally, one of his Supai friends said, well, I'll show it to you in exchange for a side of beef. So they made that deal, and then they had a closer source to haul water. Bill Jr. wrote, my mother and we kids were left alone there on the rim for weeks on and more, not knowing when Dad would come in, sometimes running low on food and water. And Bass, of course, had a Supai trail to the North Rim, so he had the first rim-to-rim route. Originally, you would cross the river in a boat. Now, before the dam, there would be spring runoffs routinely of 100,000 CFS, and you might get trapped in the North Rim. So in 1906, he installed a cable car. The cable stayed there until 1968 when the Park Service removed it. It was deemed a danger to air travel, even though you weren't supposed to be flying that low. And you can still find pieces of the cable structure on the north side and the south side. So one of the most famous stories that people always tell about Ada Bass is Laundry Day, because she had to do the laundry for the kids, she had to do the laundry for the hotel. There's no water in the rim, so if the cisterns are dry, where's she going to find water? Well, at the Colorado River. However, before the dam, the Colorado River was 51% silt. Powell described it as too thick to drink, too thin to plow. And look at these kids. They are wearing white clothes. Those were not washed in the Colorado River. So I figure she did her laundry in Shinumo Creek. And of course, it's easier when you're meeting people, oh yes, she took her laundry down to the river and spent a whole day and then came out and it took 3 days to do the laundry. That goes more easily than saying, oh yeah, there's this side creek called Shinumo Creek and she'd go down the river and cross and then go to Shinumo Creek and then do the laundry and come out. But I'm sure it was Shinumo Creek. They also had a little camp by Shinumo Creek, an orchard and gardens, and Bass actually improved existing irrigation canals that were established by the Supai. The family would sometimes winter down here just because it was nicer there and up on the rim, but of course if the river flooded they could get trapped there. And eventually they would have 3 houses. They improved the house at Bass Camp, although if there were too many tourists they still moved into the house. At Bass Siding they put in what they called the White House in 1904, and by 1911 Bass had kind of decided he was going to centralize his business concerns near the village, and he leased 2.5 acres from the Forest Service and built the tin house because it was covered with tin. But always Ada had her piano. The eldest daughter, Edith, was quite the horsewoman. Bill Jr. said he didn't know a horse that she couldn't handle. When she was 3.5 years old, she rode to the bottom by herself. By the time she was 10, she was meeting the train. And she would meet the train and say, "Hello, I'm Edith Bass. I will take you to my father's facilities." And one of the tourists, usually a guy, would say, "Well, you're a little girl. You can't do that." And she would say, "Sir, if you can keep up with me, you could lead the party." And she'd take off like a bat out of hell until he yelled uncle. Bert Lawson was working for the Basses. Of course, he was on the river trip with the Colbs, the lower half of the river trip. And he and Edith hit it off. William Wallace did not approve of this, and he sent Edith to Los Angeles to keep the couple apart. It didn't work. They got married anyway. But Edith died very young. At the age of 28, she suffered complications from surgery. One source says appendicitis, the other source said gallbladder. But whatever, it was probably some kind of a septic reaction, which would not have been uncommon in the 20s, before we had antibiotics. Bill Bass, Bill Jr., had a love affair with automobiles, and he would eventually become a driver for the Harvey Company. He said he tried to teach the parents how to drive. When Dad panicked, he would yell, "Whoa," and pull back on the steering wheel and usually run into a tree. And Mom would get distracted by the scenery. So neither of them learned to drive very rapidly. So by the 20s, tourism was changing. The park wanted the tourism centered in the park area, in the village area. They also wanted the Harvey Company to pretty much have the monopoly in the area. And tourists were changing. They were no longer coming up and spending a week here. And they didn't want to spend a whole day riding out to Bass Camp and then, a week or so wandering around and then a whole day riding back. So by 1926, Bass sold out to the Santa Fe Railroad for $25,000. Since Ada had been doing most of the work, she got a check for half. The family retired to Wickenburg. William and Ada did. But retiring is a malaprop because Bill had a mine, he had a farm, he had a gas station, he had a campground. They started what may have been the first motel in Arizona, which would become the La Siesta, and Bill Jr. would later become the manager there. So there are 2 tombstones in the graveyard. Ada is there. Bass's tombstone is there, but he's not there. According to his own wishes, he was cremated, his ashes scattered at the Temple of the Holy Grail, alternately known as Bass's tomb. And so it's rather typical of William Wallace that he's not where he's supposed to be, even in death. Ada did keep a diary, and some of the entries are, "A fine place to be marooned. God help us all this next year. The men all went into the canyon. My roof leaked. I had to hold an umbrella over my head to cook. All this gang in my hands to cook for, fix beds for, the children to wash for. I'm tired enough to die." And a lot of the entries are just SOS, same old stuff. Some of this bitterness may have been because here's William Wallace, he's Mr. Grand Canyon, he's famous, he goes on tours, and here I am, Mrs. Grand Canyon, stuck with the kids and all the work. So behind every successful man is a hardworking woman. Ada did the food and supplies, the menus, the inventory, she paid the bills. When she was gone, and she would go back east several times, the operation slowed to the pace of a stubborn mule, and she would return to a mess of unordered supplies, unwashed clothes, and dirty dishes. She was probably one of those competent people that do such a good job that you say, "Oh, I'm going to give you this because you're so good at stuff." So Bill Jr. wondered, why did Mom always come back? She never said, and she didn't write in her diary. But when she was 80 years old, he took her to the North Rim, and he said she sat on the porch looking at things only her eyes could see. And then she said, I love the canyon too. So that's it. I have, a minute?